Thanks very much, Martin, and thank you, Peter, for your welcome. So Ryan, we've heard a lot recently about the climate emergency, particularly as we head towards the COP26 summit in Glasgow in November. For those of us who are not close to the issues being discussed, it can be very confusing about what the necessary actions to tackle the climate emergency are likely to mean in practice. So in the brief time that we have, I'm hoping you're going to be able to shed some light on this for us. So perhaps you could start off by clarifying what people mean when they talk about net zero. What does net zero actually mean in practice, particularly in terms of the impact on our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, of course. So net zero is the concept that for every unit of carbon dioxide, CO2, and other greenhouse gases that we release into our atmosphere, that we would remove the same quantity from the atmosphere, whether that be through planting trees that would absorb the CO2 from the air, improving peatland habitats, which is something that's of importance in Scotland particularly, or innovative technologies that could extract CO2 from the atmosphere. In terms of what it would mean for our day-to-day lives, I think it's quite difficult for individuals to achieve net zero in isolation. The methods that briefly touched on there to invoke carbon sequestration tend to be very large-scale operations that require sort of industrial and governmental backing and support. And due to our continued reliance at the moment on fossil fuels in our day-to-day lives, makes up a large percentage of the energy mix that we use for travel, importing our food, etc. It's very challenging for an individual to not become a net emitter of CO2 in isolation. So my thoughts that in our day-to-day lives, we can obviously do what we can, what we're individually able to reduce our carbon footprint. But ultimately, it's systematic change that is what is needed to deliver net zero. And just something that I came across, I think we should keep in mind that it was big oil companies that promoted this concept of carbon footprint, our individual carbon footprint in the early 2000s as perhaps a means to push responsibility onto the individual and deflecting responsibility from big business. So not looking to absolve us of our responsibilities, but just need to keep in mind that central government have the means to make far more profound impact than the individual, but obviously we should do what we can.
Okay. We'll maybe come back later in the interview, Ryan, to what individuals can realistically do. But for the moment, thanks for that and for clarifying what we mean by net zero. So hopefully we all know what we're now talking about when we refer to that. In the lead up to COP26, we've heard from various governments as well as companies about their net zero ambitions. For example, I believe that the Scottish Parliament has set an ambition for Scotland to achieve a net zero status by 2045. In your opinion, how achievable is the 2045 target, and what might a potential route map be for actually getting to this point?
Yeah, so I mean the commitment that you referenced, achieving net zero in Scotland by 2045 was signed into law as part of the Climate Change Act of 2019. And it includes incremental targets, 70%, 75% reduction by 2030, 90% by 2040, and then through to net zero at 2045 by the latest. I think it's going to be challenging. The latest figures that were published looking at the reduction achieved in 2019 showed that our figure was 51.5% against the interim target of 55%. So obviously we're 3.5% down on what was initially set out. And I think big part of that is that there was some really good progress made through sort of the 2000s and the 2010s as we were decarbonizing the electricity sector, which has proven the most simple to transition away from fossil fuels, moving to renewable energy, wind farms, solar, etc. But what remains now is the more complex sectors: heat, transport, manufacturing, which account for the majority of our emissions. I think I saw a figure recently up to as much as 85%. So there was a climate change plan published by the Scottish Government just at the end of last year that set out their comprehensive roadmap of how they're going to achieve these targets. And it's obviously a raft of ambitious changes needed, such as There's the UK-wide transition to phase out new fossil fuel powered cars by 2030. They're also talking about decarbonising all internal flights within Scotland by 2040. So there's obviously at the moment there's progress being made on electrical planes for short haul flights, and Airbus have talked about their aims of getting to hydrogen fueled planes by 2035. But this all comes with a degree of risk and cost. They're also talking about all new built homes by 2024, which is only less than 3 years away, will only use renewable heating or zero emissions heating, so a transition away from natural gas boilers. So yeah, there was a lot of challenges. Scotland are putting a lot of emphasis on hydrogen as our potential game changer. There are technologies that exist to produce zero carbon hydrogen, and there's plenty of examples of where it's been used in a small scale, in conjunction with a wind turbine, to produce hydrogen that can power a car. But at the kind of scale that's required, it doesn't yet exist. So I think this year there's due to be a hydrogen action plan published. I think that the intention there is to set out how we're going to transition these more challenging sectors of our economy towards decarbonised energy, really. But yeah, remains to be seen how progress goes, to be honest, over the next 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Just sort of changing the sort of direction just a little bit. One of the phrases that we hear from our politicians, particularly off the back of the coronavirus pandemic, is that we need to build back better, we need to build back greener. And I've heard some commentators suggest that the transition away from carbon towards a green economy will be as far reaching the 21st century as the Industrial Revolution was 200 years ago. And it's undoubtedly the case that the overall wealth of developed nations like Scotland have benefited enormously from previous disruptions to our economy and innovation. Unfortunately, it's also the case that over the period, certainly of my lifetime, there's been a growing inequality between the haves and the have-nots in our society. My fundamental question to you is whether or not you think the ambition of reducing inequality, or levelling up, as our Prime Minister would describe it, is compatible with the need to transition away from our dependency on fossil fuels.
Yeah, I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I think they can coexist. I mean, as you say, the transition away from fossil fuels will shake up many industries, which could offer the opportunity to balance the scales between, as you say, the haves and the have-nots. But if not managed properly, or the needs and the interests of the have-nots isn't managed carefully, it could also just widen the divide between the large rich corporations and those that benefit from them, and the end users. At the moment, the latest figures in terms of fuel poverty in Scotland, there's still approximately 25% of all households in Scotland exist in fuel poverty. So that shows the stark contrast in terms of even Scotland as a wealthy nation, we still have massive challenges. You've seen from the last week or two the spike in the cost of natural gas and the alarm that that's caused, and the impact that will have on the end consumer. So due to the variable nature, the intermittent nature of renewable sources, or a robust solution is kind of required to maintain a security of supply to the most vulnerable, minimize spikes in the cost of energy. And yeah, as you said, inequality grew massively towards the end of the 20th century and continued in the couple of decades of the 21st century. I think just before COVID hit, tax year end 2020, inequality was at its highest point at any time in the previous 10 years. So, while there will be opportunities to reduce inequality if we manage this correctly, there's multiple proposals. You can look at carbon taxing, the highest emitters, frequent flyers, utilizing those funds to subsidize and support those worse off. But that will come down to governmental policies, and I'm sure much more could have been done to tackle inequality, previously in other industries and other in other eras, but it'll come down to the mandate that we give our government, to be honest.
Okay, thank you for that. We already alluded several times to the upcoming summit in Glasgow. What do you consider to be the key actions that need to be agreed by world leaders, both at COP26 and thereafter, if the climate emergency is to be taken seriously?
Yeah, I mean, in answering this question, I looked back at what was agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was COP21. I think fundamentally it's going to be difficult to achieve agreement on tangible steps. You know, it's 200 countries that are coming together to try to agree how we move forward. And you know, it's been reported this week that the Australian Prime Minister might not be attending, and President Xi of China may not be attending, which you know, it demonstrates the progress that's still needed in attitudes towards how serious the situation is. You know, the Paris Agreement called for all 195 signatory countries to cut greenhouse emissions, and there was a pledge that, you know, global temperature rise would be kept well below 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5 degrees C. And at the moment, the existing pledges that were delivered in Paris, it's now predicted that that would lead to an overall rise of 3 degrees. So, you know, many governments need to pledge to tougher emission cuts, you know, by 2030 as the target. And, you know, there's many governments in the developed world that haven't published their plans to achieve net zero by 2050, which is sort of seen as one of the key milestones. There's also the question of how do the rich nations subsidize the developing world to assist them through this transition. And in Paris, there was a pledge that $100 billion a year, $100 billion a year would be provided by richer nations to the poorer nations, but it's still not actually been formally agreed 5-6 years on. So I think the key elements that need to be negotiated are, you know, carbon market mechanisms. So how do we actually put a price on the emissions that countries are emitting, and that could allow low emitters to sell basically, you know, their allowance to other countries, you know, monetizing and incentivizing countries to actually reduce their emissions and make a profit from it. And this whole like funding loss and damage. So how does the established rich world fund and support you know, the developing nations through the loss and damage that inevitably, unfortunately, we'll all start to experience more and more. We've already seen it in the news, unfortunately, flooding, wildfires, etc. So I think there needs to be a coming together and a real understanding between how is this going to work, how are we all going to work together, because as I mentioned, off the back of Paris in 2015, there hasn't been the kind of meaningful action that you would hope globally. I mean, in that period, we saw America obviously leave the Paris Agreement, and now they're back. So, you know, things can change very quickly. So, you know, watch this space, basically.
Okay. I'm going to hand back to you in a minute, Martin, to open up to the audience. So perhaps the online audience could be thinking about what questions they'd like to put to Ryan. But before I do, I think, I mean, you've already said, you made it clear, I think, that really the obligation, the action needs to rest primarily with governments and to a lesser extent, companies, corporates, that they really hold the key as to whether or not we as a human race are able to do anything to slow down the warming of our planet. However, there are many individuals and potentially some on this meeting who intuitively want to do their bit, and you've touched on it at the outset that you know, the grand scheme of things, we're not going to make much of a difference. But if people do want to do their thing or do something to try and contribute towards a kind of greener economy and a slowing down or reduction of our carbon footprint, you know, anything else that you would add or suggest around how people might achieve that in practice?
Yeah, I think for those that obviously have the means, there's many different changes we can make in our day-to-day lives. You know, you could look to if you haven't already, switch to an energy tariff, an electricity tariff that's produced from 100% renewable energy. You could drive less. Reducing road car kilometers by 20% is part of Scotland's roadmap to net zero by 2045. You could drive electric. Obviously, that's I would suggest if that's the way that you like to go, then ensure that you're charging from home, that your energy tariff is a green tariff. Otherwise, you might not be incurring any emissions at the tailpipe, but the emissions caused to produce your electricity, upstream, kind of negates some of the benefits. So think about that. There's been a lot recently in the news about the carbon footprint associated with the food that we eat. So trying to not purchase food that's been imported from the other side of the world, buy fruit and veg that are in season, locally if you can, to avoid racking up additional carbon emissions on your plate. I mean, ultimately, it'll come down to personal choice and the amount of financial burden we can take on. And unfortunately, it's one that many people can't afford. And that's the challenge, is when we're talking about these sort of existential crises, and things are unfortunately becoming more forward in our minds with what's happening on the news. But the challenge is putting it on individuals and making it our individual responsibility rather than a collective responsibility. So, there's other things. There's many charitable causes, I'm sure, that people could look into, getting involved in planting trees, cleaning up beaches, etc. But ultimately, I think the most difference we can make as individuals is at the ballot box. Right through from local elections through to our general elections. If as I feel it should be, the environment is one of your top priorities, then look at what the political parties are proposing, and weigh that when you're balancing up who you're going to vote for.
Great. Fantastic. For the moment, Ryan, thank you. Martin, if I can hand back to you to facilitate some further questions and answers, if that's okay.
Yep. And thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Michael. Well done, Ryan. You handled some tough political questions there rather well. You're a natural politician, so well done. And I admire your confidence in politicians. It's not an experience that I've shared in my long life, but I hope you're right. So if you've got a question, folks, just raise your hands and we'll take it in order. David's the first one to raise a hand, and remember to come off mute as you ask your question. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Ryan, for answering those questions. You mentioned about carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. I wondered what the other greenhouse gases are and where they come from and how we can reduce them.
One of the big ones is methane. That comes from degrading waste, and also when people talk about the impact of like beef farming, the amount of methane produced by cows is very high. And the problem with methane is that 1 unit of methane, so say 1 meter cubed of methane, if that's released to the atmosphere, it's actually 22 times more effective as a greenhouse gas than the equivalent unit of CO2. So basically its ability to trap in heat is far higher than CO2's ability. So that's why at landfill, for example, there's a lot of methane that'll come off from degrading waste. So capturing this methane and even burning it and producing carbon dioxide rather than methane is actually a benefit. So that's why there's a lot of push in terms of reducing our meat consumption, because methane's a big emitter from that sector. It's probably the main other one that I can think of. Is obviously a lot of sort of other pollutants, nitrous oxides, etc., associated with car pollution. But I'd say methane is one to keep an eye on. And it's interesting because I know you made the point about trusting politicians. I know there is a hesitancy at government level to recommend that people eat less meat, because obviously there's a lot of the economy, the farm economy, is propped up on very traditional, long-standing practices. But the reality is, cows aren't great. cows aren't great. So anything you can do, if you can eat less meat, or I mean, I'm not a vegan. I'm not gonna claim to be. So I do enjoy a little bit of meat now and then. So anything we can do would be I think a benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your question. And Ryan, good answer. Just following up David's question, just very briefly, Ryan, is the logic of your argument about the beef industry an expectation that we will end up with no farm animals? Is that the logic of that argument?
Oh, I mean, it's a complex question. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure whether or not at the moment with our population that we have, whether we have the means to feed all 7.7 billion of us without, the sort of traditional farming practices that we have. It is always a question I ask myself when I see a lot of these promotional adverts and pieces of clips online about going vegan. It's do we have the means and the resources to transition? How quickly can we transition? It's probably a slightly larger question than I know the answer to be honest. I think, easy for us in the developed world with our, comfortable lives to say that we can make these sacrifices, move to plant-based food. But in reality, there's a lot of the world that don't have that luxury. So I think there's much wider considerations that'll play in, and I think it feeds back to what Michael touched on about inequality. While there's those who don't have the means to, take these steps that they're being told are required, you're going to struggle to get global buy-in. So I think it is a difficult question to answer.
Well, you've answered it very well, if I may say so, Ryan. You pointed out the trend, which is obviously all we can hope to do. Other questions, please, just raise a hand. And it's over to Ian Percy, and if you could come off mute, please. Thank you, Ian.
Ryan, thank you very much for what a fascinating discussion on this. I know we've got COP26 coming along, and we in Britain and Boris is very keen that we all meet these targets by 2045. But what do we do about? I mean, I was in Bangkok last year, and when I look at the smog and the industry out there and so on, I think to myself, we're doing our very best as a little company, a little country. What pressures can we bring on some of the other countries who are massive contributors to the problem? And I wondered whether there were any pressures at the energy end. I mean, I know politicians keep talking, but they come and go. That's the trouble. The minister lasts about 5 years in office, so he makes promises. But what are the energy companies doing to be able to try and manage this process?
I mean, I think that, as you say, like China have committed to moving away from using coal by 2060, but as part of their route map, they're going to continue to increase their usage of coal until 2030, and at that point it'll peak, and then it will start to taper away, which from what scientists are telling us, is just not going to cut it if we want to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees C. So it is a real challenge, and especially you would look to some of the superpowers, America, for example, to lead the way, but through the Trump era, obviously there was a big transition back towards coal and America first and all those things. So it is difficult to make the argument to those who maybe are struggle to make ends meet as it is, why they should be making further sacrifices, paying more at the meter, when ultimately there's billions of people throughout the world that aren't making any sacrifice. I would just say that I suppose through showing leadership, you would hope to demonstrate that we can bring manufacturing back within the UK to fund, to mobilize the green energy revolution, as it might be, and by doing that, you bring down the cost. You bring down the cost of these technologies and of producing green electricity, and ultimately, a lot of it comes back to how much it's going to cost to transition, and keeping jobs in manufacturing in your own country. Everyone's looking out for themselves ultimately. So I think we just need to try to pave the way and, you know, encourage as far as we can those around us to follow our lead. But yeah, it is a massive issue and a massive question. Unfortunately, a lot of the places in the world that are maybe transitioning more slowly are those that are going to, you know, feel most keenly the effects of climate change. And by the time you get into that sort of situation, it may well be too late. And energy companies similarly, I think that, you know, the big oil and gas companies that have, you know, historically profited and benefited from the industry, they know the direction of travel. Whether or not we get there quickly enough or not remains to be seen. But, you know, they're diversifying their portfolios, investing in offshore wind, etc. They know that, you know, the day is coming when the transition will be made. They want to still be at the top of the pile when that happens. It's just whether or not things can move quickly enough. Because obviously they want to minimize their risks, these big successful companies. So if it means transitioning a little bit more slowly, potentially they might not be overly bothered by that. Just have to see how things go over the next sort of decade, really. I think between now and 2030 is very important to see what happens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for your question, and Ryan for your excellent answer, if I may say so. Other questions, please just raise a hand if Peter's ready to ask a question, and Peter's just coming off mute.
No, unless there's anyone else queuing up.
No, please go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think the last issue brings up quite an ethical point as well, that if you look at this country, we introduced the Industrial Revolution. We're only where we are because ultimately we polluted it all those years ago. And it seems very contradictory to start telling other countries that are emerging out of what traditionally were called third world status without recognized sort of manufacturing or industry. I think it's quite contradictory to say to them, look, you're not allowed to do what we did in the past. We polluted the world, and now we're telling you you're not allowed to develop and get to a level like that. And so I think rather than the onus being on developing countries to sort it out, it should be first world countries such as ourselves who take the lead on this. And you know, ethically, it's a huge point of discussion, and you cannot blame developing countries for wanting just to get to a level at which they have good infrastructure and good sustainability to carry on too. So just wondering, Ryan, if you had any thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree that you know, it's much easier for us to sit here, you know, after 150 years plus of economic prosperity built off, you know, exploitation of natural resources, you know, our reach, far-reaching influence around the world to utilize the natural resources of other countries as well, to then turn around and say, oh, you know, sorry, but you've missed the boat. We've built ourselves up using this technology and these resources, but now no one else is allowed to do so. So yeah, the question of funding, you know, almost reparations, I think without that, which was one of the elements that was sort of agreed to be moved towards at Paris 2015, $100 billion from the wealthy nations to support the transition for you know, what would have been traditionally called third world countries is key, because, you know, these countries don't have the sort of wealth to be able to have the choices that we have. So we need to help them, and ultimately this is a global issue. We can't just think about this you know, ourselves, or, you know, China's not doing something, so therefore, you know, let's just forget about it. It really needs to be a global effort. And yeah, it's a, you know, the historical activities of nations and the question of reparations has always been very contentious and political, you know, throughout history. You know, you look at America and, you know, reparations and what's been pushed from in some sectors in terms of, you know, slavery and reparations, you know, towards Black communities, and it's a huge challenge, and it will become a political challenge ultimately. So we need like-minded people and consensus to be reached that there's a right thing to do. It might not be an easy thing to do, but it is the right thing to do, and ultimately it's for ourselves as well. It's not just for those poorer nations.
Thank you, Ryan. Again, excellent answer. And you're a natural politician, if I may say so. So if you decide to go into politics, I shall certainly vote for you. And I don't mind what party you join. So there's a floating voter. Any final questions before I hand back to Michael for a final question? Then Peter will give a vote of thanks. I've got one question I'm itching to ask because it's in your field, but I'm just looking around to see whether anybody. Yes, Pamela, please, if you come off mute, Pamela. Thank you for waiting patiently, and please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much indeed. I was just wanted to ask Ryan whether we are in crisis at the moment. What's your view on that? Because you meet Greta Thunberg and you kind of think, we are in crisis, and then you hear other politicians talking and you think, well, it's not really that desperate.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in the generations as well? Is there a difference in our approach to things as opposed to your approach, or I don't know. Anyway, I'd be interested to get your take on it.
Yeah, I think we are in crisis, to be honest. Try not to be too negative about it, to be honest, because we do need to emphasize on what we can do and the hope that we do have, because without it, people will give up. They'll say, what's the point? What's the point of making all these sacrifices if it's not going to be enough? I know that Greta Thunberg, her approach is sort of say it as it is, try and shock people, I guess, sometimes into action. But unfortunately, I tend to find that certainly those of us that are fortunate enough to be more comfortable in our lives, we don't tend to like change, radical change. I mean, look at what happened with COVID. Some scientists had quite bleak predictions of what was coming back in sort of January, February, and there was a desire for that to just not be reality. Unfortunately, it has become a reality. So we do need to listen to the experts. I'm not an expert on this. The experts are the scientists that have dedicated their lives to this research. So we do need to listen to them on it. But I do think that even the difference between 2.5 degrees C warming and 3 degrees C warming will have a significant impact on hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people's lives. So, every improvement we can make on the situation, on the predictions, will affect people. So why not do everything we can to minimize the impact? I think we're too far gone to have no impact. It's just now a question of how bad is it going to be, unfortunately.
Thank you for that question, Pamela, and thank you, Ryan. Final question from me, and then back to Michael, and then for Peter to give a vote of thanks. Ryan, my question, coming back to your own field of wind and solar and possibly wave. Can wind, solar and wave green power do enough for us in Scotland to meet these very ambitious titles? And I ask that question because obviously you're an expert on wind, so please go ahead.
I think that obviously we've had days recently where Scotland has been 100% powered electricity wise on renewable green energy, which is obviously a great measure of how far we've come. I think that because of the intermittent nature of solar and wind particularly, obviously there's times when the wind speeds are too low and the turbines won't be turning, and obviously in Scotland where the sun's not shining, so solar generation is at a minimum, where at the moment we are going back to more traditional energy sources to provide the base load that we need. So gas-fired power stations. There's obviously nuclear, Torness, not far from where I am. I think that we need to. That's why I think hydrogen is where the Scottish government is putting a lot of their eggs in the hydrogen basket, because basically what you could do is you could use wind energy, solar energy when the seasons are on our side, and you can use that to produce green hydrogen, which can be stored and utilized like natural gas is used today. So I think that hydrogen offers a potential transition away without, completely tearing up what we're conventionally used to in terms of having a boiler in your house instead of natural gas that would run on hydrogen. There's a lot of work and sort of small projects being run by SGN, the gas network operator in Scotland, in Fife, and some sort of small isolated gas networks, where they're looking at increasing the percentage of hydrogen, blending in some hydrogen into natural gas, seeing how our appliances behave, and then ultimately maybe transitioning towards replacing a lot of the existing network with different material pipes that could cope with high concentrations of hydrogen. I think that we need a facility to store the potential that's available from wind, solar, tidal, etc. Because at the moment we don't have enough battery technology, hydrogen, those sorts of solutions. Because without that, we'll have real trouble keeping the lights on at all times, balancing the grid, those sorts of things. So it's these emerging technologies that are really needing to pave the way the next decade or two.
Thank you, Ryan. And hopefully, as an optimist and being in the industry, you'll say that industry will solve the problem in the end. But I'm putting words into your mouth, so I'll let you think about that. Back to you, Michael, for your final question, please.
Yeah, well, it's not so much a question, but more a comment and an observation. I think you mentioned at the outset, Martin, that the church is not dead, and I would agree with that. But I think one of the great things and great opportunities we have as a church is to engage young people on what is, frankly, the most, one of the most important and one of the issues that young people are really interested in. I think we've seen this afternoon just the passion that comes through, as well as the energy and enthusiasm. And I'm absolutely, delighted to have, had Ryan share his thoughts and expertise with us this afternoon, and hope that we'll see much more of Ryan and other colleagues like him at these and kind of future similar events, because I think it's really important that we all engage in this debate, this discussion, and really try to make our own contribution towards improving the situation and trying to persuade politicians and companies, corporates, that it is important that we do the right thing. And a very final point before I hand over to Peter: when those of us that are blessed by being relatively wealthy, we can actually use our wealth in green promoting ways. So increasingly in the investment industry, the pension industry are looking to divert resources into those firms and companies that are taking this issue seriously. And I think over time it will actually become a profitable exercise, both for corporates and individuals, to direct their wealth towards greener technologies. And that way, I think we do give ourselves the opportunity to continue to build and develop in our own wealth, and encourage other countries and sectors to follow that. This is actually going to be net profitable over the medium to long term. It's not just about cost. This is actually an investment in our future, and therefore I think positioning it in that way potentially encourages others to follow suit. But with that, thanks again to Ryan on my behalf. I'm sure, Peter, you'd like to do likewise.
And final words to Peter, please.
Thank you. If I can just perhaps just point out, as we're all aware, a lot of people said that COVID was obviously horrible, and it continues to be, but it did give the world, the planet, a chance to breathe for 18 months with far less air travel, far fewer people on the roads, and everyone just having to pause. So the planet paused, we allowed it to breathe. But I mean, I take from this, we must just not return to as it was and suffocate it once more. And Ryan, you've given us some really good pointers as to how to ensure that, we take away from this, just as we take away from the last 18 months, the real need to pause, take stock, and ensure we don't return to doing things the same way as before. For many churches, this Sunday will be Harvest Thanksgiving, and it gives us an opportunity to be grateful for all the great gifts we have, the beautiful planet that we live in, and all the resources. I mean, the key thing to come out of Harvest, I think, is always we may be able to produce it, but we've not worked out how to share it. And this is going to become the big thing. And if you think particularly about the advances over COVID vaccinations, here we are sitting, I'm sure if we'd wanted to be were vaccinated, whereas a good proportion of the world just haven't had that opportunity either. So for me, coming out of this is the idea we really need to level out, because if these words ever mean anything, we're all in it together. Certainly when it comes to climate, we definitely are. So Ryan, huge thank you. Thank you for everyone attending, being part of this St. Cuthbert's gathering, to Michael for chairing, and for Martin for bringing us all together.